kind of struck by that.
How do you think the people reacted to him, the audience?
There was a core of people that thought, you know, right away that Rick was great and they knew what he was doing. A lot of people just shook their heads and said, this guy's crazy.
What about the first time you met him? Do you remember when that was?
No, I really don't remember the first time I actually met Rick. I wanted to meet him a long time before I did, but there was always kind of a problem between the bands he was in, sort of resenting our band, and took a while to overcome that. But he came down here once and he looked at a lot of the pictures on the wall, and they were all pictures that he had on his wall, and we kind of knew that, you know, we were kindred spirits as soon as we talked.
What happened that night? Is that like the first night you guys kind of like had a... Did you guys talk a lot that night, or?
No, not that night. I didn't really get to talk to him until we started playing together, which I was really excited about. You know, when you guys came to me and said you needed a bass player, because, you know, Rick was someone I always really wanted to work with. I always admired everything about him, but mostly he was for real. I think I've played with most of the outstanding musicians of this area, but nobody could touch Rick.
Like, the bands between the Rom Boys and the Sex Kings, do you remember any of them, or? There's like a period where the bands never actually get out and play, but they were...
No, I wasn't really around then, you know. I wasn't really... It was always kind of maddening, but I wasn't part of the circle, even though I wanted to be. There was always resentment that took a long time to overcome, it seemed like.
Let's go into the Sex Kings, and you were there at their first performance at Shirley's.
Was that their first performance? Yeah, I was there, and that was definitely the event of the century in our community. And that was just...
Can you just describe why you feel it's that way, or what happened?
Well, it was the dingiest little redneck bar, you know, that you could find. And there was, you know, the band wearing Tina Turner wigs, and Rick wearing just a pair of long johns, flinging himself around on the floor, and people throwing beer cans at him. And it's the whole scene. But the funny thing is that on an ordinary night at Shirley's, there was always a fight. And that night, even though you would expect big trouble, I think nobody knew what to make of it, and there were no fights at all that night. The violence was all part of the ritual.
How do you think the Sex Kings from outer space, what their effect was in the music scene at that time locally?
Well, you compare it to what the Sex Pistols did. It's they were kind of shock troops, and I always felt it was sort of a reaction to us, you know, what we were doing, because we'd been around so long that, you know, we were almost established, and we became, you know, the targets, and they were like the antithesis of us. They were what we used to be, and I was always kind of jealous of that, the position they had there.
Go ahead if you want to look, because I don't need to think a minute.
Okay, I'm gonna get the stuff I'm saying, you know, mentioning our band.
Are there any other Sex Kings performances or things about them that really stand out? And
nothing I can think of right off the bat.
let's go into Sex Machine. How do you think Sex Machine was different than his other bands?
It was musically a little tighter, I thought, but, you know, I was in it, so maybe I can't be objective about it. But I thought his material was a little more effective when it was put across with a little more cohesiveness.
How about talking about the last night at the hotel when they said he could never come back in there again? Can you explain what happened or why that was?
Well, I just think they didn't like Rick. He blamed it on profanity. Not that you wouldn't hear profanity in there every night anyway, but I guess it was over a microphone. It was part of a performance.
How about just talking about, you explain what kind of attitude Rick projected when he played out, and his whole image of his art, I guess,
Well, it was nice having the insight knowing Rick, because Rick always had a core of insecurity about himself, which made him a little defensive about it, but you would never know it to see him. He was just a cocky little bull, on stage. He was totally in control of himself. I thought he was amazing. I've never seen anybody compare to him. The people that were his influences, like Iggy Pop and Jim Morrison, I always looked at Rick as an equal. Not that he was copying them, but he was on their level.
How much do you think the fact that he looked up to those people affected how he lived his personal life as far as being self-destructive and things?
I wouldn't blame it on, I wouldn't blame it on anything. I think he saw a kindred spirit. I think he would have been that way anyway. He was interested in that because he could relate to it. But I think, I don't think it was copying those people and their lifestyles. That's just the way people like that are. Rick was one of those people.
You think he was basically an angry person, or at least at some point, or?
Yeah, there was some deep stuff there that I never found out about. I don't know what was at the heart of the matter. He was definitely driven, and there were definitely demons. But in talking to him, I feel that there was, at least part of him was at peace with the world, or was trying to be and succeeding. Towards the end anyway, I felt like he had a grasp on things, especially when the band was going. I don't know how it was with him when the Sex Kings got back together, but when we were really working well and things were really clicking and it was fun to be in a band and everything, I felt Rick was at peace with himself.
Is there any way you can describe the experience of actually playing and being on stage with him?
It was so exciting. It's the greatest thing I've ever done. Because it wasn't an act or a performance. Rick just went out and did that stuff.
Okay, we're rolling. Let's talk about his paintings. Like somebody might look at one of his paintings and say, well, this is just somebody throwing paint on canvas. Do you think it was?
No way. Well, Rick could look and take any one of his paintings and point at, what looked like a splotch of paint and tell you the story behind that. Nothing was random with him. It meant something, and he knew what. He was an artist. He really had it together. One idea I heard him talking about, I don't think he ever did, but I wish he would have, was pouring paint over himself and flinging himself around a huge canvas on the floor, which would be great. Just having that idea is good enough, I guess.
Just the music, the sound of music. Can you describe the style of music for people who have absolutely no concept of what kind of music we're talking about here?
Well, when I first met Rick, and just on the surface, my first reaction to him was I used to say, well, Rick's a little Jim Morrison, and there were definitely a lot of similarities there, but nothing that you could call copying, but just a dark vision, and definitely religion was always part of the focus for him.
Do you know anything about what his religious beliefs were, or how that may have affected his life, or how things?
Rick's religious thoughts were well formulated, and he, he was right with God in his own mind, but somebody else might look at it and think it was skewed a little bit. But he was a very religious person. It might seem odd to somebody that didn't know.
I guess we should talk about drugs some. I mean, how much do you think drugs affected his life both in the past and in the later years?
They weren't a problem when I knew him. I think they were earlier. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to go by hearsay. I wasn't around then. There was a period there where different kinds of barbiturates and stuff were a problem for just about everybody in the community. And it was a really bad time. I didn't take part in any of that. Wasn't the kind of thing I was into. I think he had a hard time then. But the period that I knew him well, I never saw drugs get in the way of anything.
What about, let's talk about like in the early days when like he first started, like maybe like about what kind of underground community there was and what influence he had on other musicians, especially the younger ones.
I wouldn't know what to compare it to. He had his own little corner of it nailed down and nobody could touch his position. He was the true spirit of that whole scene. As much as our band, was sort of the figurehead of it, people always looked up to him. The creative community always looked to Rick. He was an arbiter of taste, where a lot of people wouldn't decide whether they liked a new album unless they asked Rick what he thought of it. It's one of the things I miss about him, actually. When I read a new book or I hear a new album, one of the first things I think is, I wonder what Rick would think of this. I'd like to go talk to Rick and see what he thinks of this, and you can't anymore.
What about his poetry and his writing? Can you say anything about that? How it
it was all, I always looked at it as all, a total package. His performance, his lyrics, his poetry, his painting, it was all Rick. It was all tapped out of the same vein.
Let's see. Can you think of anything that should be hitting on him? Do you know anything about his father? What he had told me once, that he really wanted to see his father, and that would like help him deal with a lot of the things inside.
I know the name he adopted for himself, his stage name, Otis Fenella. Otis was his father's name, and that that was definitely a big conscious and subconscious factor in a lot of his art. But I don't know what the story is. I don't know anything about Rick's dad.
What about his bad side? I mean, he would like piss people off so bad. Can you explain at all why that was?
It just seems to be most people that are like Rick have that side to them. I don't know why that is. I can't explain the psychological reasons behind it.
Did he look at you in that position where he would piss you off, or was he always?
I can't think of any particular instance, but I sure saw, when other people would get mad at him, I could always see why they were, but he never did that to me. He never did anything like that to me that I can remember. There was always a good rapport between Rick and I. We weren't really close, but we were. We were. I always felt connected to him, and there seemed to be a respect between us. He never pulled any shit with me.
What do you think about him and Devo? Is there anything you can say about the way they stuck together all those years? What their connection had to...
Well, they were a riot when I worked with them. I mean, I just laughed the whole time. You never knew when to take them seriously, but they were the central committee. But actually, Rick was the central committee. Although Debo will probably deny this now, but Debo would wait until he heard what Rick had to say about something, and then he would chime in and say, "Yes, we denounce you. We, the Central Committee, denounce your ideas." But there was a real, it was Mick and Keith there. There was a real chemistry between those two guys.
As we talk to people, I mean, there's just some reason he affected people like very strongly, and it's like, as we do this, we're like trying to figure out why that is, and it's like, how do you put your finger on what that was?
I think everybody that knew Rick, I mean, some people were luckier than me. I had one particular night that I can remember, and I mean, he and I had a lot of moments together. Every time we played out, it was always a great experience. But he and I had one night where we sat up and talked about religion and life and death and, the typical existential angst, stay up till dawn type of thing. And I think everybody that knew him had at least one night like that with him, and connected with him, and felt connected with him for the rest of, I still feel connected to him. But I think everybody clicked with Rick like that.
One thing I remember about him is that he was like, before we went on stage that one night, he like told me that he loved me, and it's like one of the few men I've ever known that said that, and I think it's just unusual.
Well, the very last time I saw Rick alive, the Sex Kings were playing at the Laurel, or whatever it's called now, and I showed up, and I ran the camera for a while. They were videotaping that night, and I ran the camera for a little while, and then I had a harmonica with me, and I knew the songs from Sex Machine, so I went up and played harmonica on a couple songs with them, and we did 2 songs. When we were done with the second one, I turned to him, and the last thing I said to Rick was "thank you," which, as it turned out, I'm glad I got to say that to him. And the last thing that Rick did for me was, after I said thank you to him, he grabbed my hand and he kissed it. And he was given to gestures like that. But yeah, just like you said, I mean, it wasn't a sexual thing or anything, but I look back on it later and I thought, I'm really, that was sort of a perfect parting between Rick and I.
Another thing that sticks in my mind like that he would always make us all wear those black armbands,
Yeah.
It was like a very, I don't know what you would say.
We were on the club. We were definitely in the club that summer. We were the world's most exclusive boys club, and I was proud to be a part of it. I was really proud to be a part of it.
What do you think, now that he's gone, the other musicians, and just the other people that saw him, what will last in their memory of him?
I mean, my memory of him hasn't faded a bit, and I don't think anybody that knew him, I think he'll be with him forever. I don't think he'll ever be replaced, and he'll never be replaced. And I think he definitely left a serious void. I mean, there isn't much of a community anymore, just little pockets of resistance. But he's irreplaceable. I think his songs will hang around. I think local bands will be doing his songs for a while.
What as I'm like trying to put this together, it's like, other than for us, for the people who knew him, I mean, why should people care about this? I'm like asking this myself. I mean, can you give me any idea of what You know, what is it about this that will make me think?
People like Rick are so unique and so rare. I mean, you have to treasure people like that. You have to put up with their quirks, you know, and forgive them for them, because everybody they've all got them. But I don't know. That's hard to put your finger on and verbalize. I mean, why should we remember any great artist? And that's all I can say. Rick was a great artist. Rick was a genius. I think that's my opinion anyway. And why should we remember Picasso? I don't know, but we should.
Do you remember how you found out about him dying?
Yeah, I work construction with JR, and Rick worked for the same company, but he was off on disability. And JR's wife called down to work right before we went out in the morning. We work construction. Right before we went out in the morning, JR came out and told me, and I was just in a daze all day. And being so far away from here, you know, I was a couple hundred miles away from here. I think it's a common reaction. You know, I had myself talked into thinking it was all a mistake, and it hadn't actually happened. And I was going to give him all kinds of hell when I got home for making me worry about him.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else we should cover. Any stories you can think of? Or...
No, I can't think of anything.
Let's go to the phone. Go ahead and read the one you liked. Get ready to walk down to the camera if you want.
Okay, we're ready.
I think I know a secret, a well-kept secret. I don't know the whole story. It's this crazy tool. I've met with tomorrow to avoid the surprise. I drown in my dreaming. I drown in blue. I'm my only real enemy, my only limitation. It's life or death knowledge. Stupid man-boy's chance. I ask a question. Does night fall in heaven? I slip past the roadblocks. I was a fool. I ask the question, did heaven give me this crazy tool?
Yeah. One last thing, as far as his death, I mean, there were a few people that suspected that it was suicide. Do you think there's any chance of that?
No, I know for certain it wasn't. I mean, you know, Rick was no angel, and it's like when Brian Jones died, it was ruled death by misadventure, and I think that's what you could probably call Rick's. But I know the pride and the love and the care he had for his daughter Ivy. There's absolutely no way that he would have done something like that. And Rick seemed really happy, you know, at that time. He seemed to have it together. He wasn't. I mean, artists slip into despondency sometimes, but he wasn't there.
One other thing I'm thinking is that, you know, like the people in our class, our culture was so different. When they heard about this story, they kind of think of like the drugs as like coloring. For instance, the student teacher said, well, you know, are you going to make this guy out as a hero when here he's this guy like taking drugs and stuff? I mean, that colors him in some people's minds to such an extent, which of course, you know, it's just like no big deal if, you know, to people who are used to what drugs mean. Is there anything you can say about that? You know, why?
I don't know. I mean, you can't pin the blame for that squarely on Rick's shoulders. it's a problem and it shouldn't be glamorized, but it's a part of people like Rick. Like you said, I mean, it was no great surprise to anybody that was in the circle. I don't, that's not what should be remembered about Rick.
That's pretty good.